Hello and welcome to our fourth week in Politics of Code. So, while the question of politics of technology is already polarizing and has seen now, I would say, like 4 decades of continuous discussion. With, I would say, arguments on either side that kind of, to some extent, can be followed and to some extent might be a bit too reductionist. This polarization in discussion is even more true, or has been even more true over the last maybe 5 years or so in social media. So social media is an interesting phenomenon because, I remember when it started about 15 years ago, many people who were in their maybe like 30s or 40s at that time, like my age or a bit older, how I was at that time, would say, well, what does that mean even? I mean, which media are not social? So I think we have to discuss a bit further what we mean by the term social media to actually differentiate it and have it well defined in terms of why is not all media created social. And of course, you might say that. I mean, a newspaper or a television station, of course, doesn't appear out of thin air. Of course, it's embedded in a society and its political system, its audiences or users, and the people who create the media. So there is, of course, a social process in media. And when we look into the history of social media in the, I would say, narrow sense in which most people now use the term, which means online community media, user-based content media, or whatever you might call it, it shall become clear that we mean something very specific by the term social media, and not just any media that has to do with social factuality. So just to introduce what is happening, I mentioned the decline of mass media over the last generation or so, and that is most sharply to be seen in newspapers. I mean, no matter what metrics you use, here in this always resourceful numbers that Benedict Evans provides, you see it really doesn't matter. I mean, even if you just count the tonnage of paper pulp that is consumed, you see the decline. So it is without question happening that people's attitudes towards media content and news media, as we shall see also, rapidly changed over the last generation. At the same time, of course, we have the creation of a new platform. It's very hard to tell what the internet actually is. I mean, thinking of having a proper, well-defined criterion. I mean, the medium of media is always another medium. This is Marshall McLuhan's kind of fractal or recursive definition of media. So the content of media is always another medium. So the content of the internet, of course, is the web or email or whatever is happening on the internet. So the internet might be seen only as a carrier. But the same as radio waves, of course, the internet has a lot to do with what's happening on it. So you can't just say, well, the internet is just one carrier like the copper wires in the ground or radio waves in the air. I mean, it has as much power over its content and what's happening there as any other carrier does if you see it as a medium. So you have this stack of thinking of media. One is the physical layer, that is, for example, the radio waves. And then you have the channel, which could be, for example, a radio program, and then you have the content of that program and many other things going on here. But if you just look at the numbers and put some things that happen, you see how very recent this development is. And it is, as I say, about a generation or so back that it becomes actually visible. We see exponential growth in a lot of things that facilitate social media. In particular, it is the spread of mobile broadband, not only in the West, but really across the globe. So over the last 5 years or so, the gap really closed, and you can fairly say that most of the world's population is connected with a phone, to some extent at least, to the internet. That might not be a very good connection. I mean, thinking of how much the internet here in my current location, which is a hotel room, breaks down. That has also nothing to do, obviously, with how much money you pay. It's just a question of how well the infrastructure in your building is maintained. I mean, that is one thing. And then, of course, of governmental influences. Like if you look rural Germany, you might think of Germany as being a very well-developed country with a very like one of the first telephone infrastructures in the world that has been laid out, I mean, really into the last corner of the country. But when it comes to mobile broadband, many rural places in the conservatively governed states like Bavaria fall behind. So you have some connection, which is usually 2G or GPRS, so very low band. You can send messages over that and have other low bandwidth things running, but you can't use things like iOS or Android. I mean, switching the phone on immediately pulls like a megabyte of data out of the air just to update what the phone thinks it needs. And if you think of pulling a website, I mean, if the website is only text, that's fine. But if you include any kind of library, like, for example, JavaScript libraries, think of processing, I mean, P5.js, as we in interactive media so much love to put on our websites. The P5.js library is, I think, something like 70 kilobytes, so 70,000 bytes. And it takes a while to be loaded over GPRS, and you get the timeout warning. So it actually is de facto not connected. So this is the reality. It is a lot of political reality. But in the end, I mean, we have in particular in urban areas throughout the world, more and more pervasive coverage with mobile broadband. And if you look on the development of the devices, this is just my own history of devices. I mean, like through the to the decade of when that took place. From a phone that I at that time found totally cutting edge, great sound. It was very small, as the ruler shows you, could fit in any pocket, and then came the much more bulky BlackBerry. The BlackBerry was the first, I would say, widespread smartphone. It was very good for texting, and it had end-to-end encryption, so it was very safe, and it was a great way of doing email. And the BlackBerry was actually the first smartphone that was also used by, in particular, British teenagers to text. So this is kind of a moment in time in the early 2000s when BlackBerry became a thing that I would say better off, kind of an elite of teenagers in the UK starts texting. And then the BlackBerry gets cheaper and cheaper. And of course, what happens then around 2008 to 2010 is the smartphone revolution. I mean, the iPhone came out and immediately becomes a success in 2008, 2009. I mean, it really skyrocketed in many countries, despite its, I would say, competitive pricing here. This is really was like 3 times as expensive as the next competitor here. But the phone that you see here, that was the first Google phone, Google Nexus 1. Came out in 2009, and it was a very good phone, I think. I mean, and that introduced me into the touch screen. I am very good in writing on the keyboard. This is how I was trained, so I'm very fast in writing on a typewriter or on a keyboard. And I thought that I could never adjust to the touchscreen, and it took me like a day or so, and I was very fast in typing there. So that is the interesting thing. I mean, my parents in their 80s have no problem. I mean, you hand them a tablet or a smartphone and they immediately can use that. Small children have an intuitive approach to it, and that is the fascinating aspect of this form factor. It seems, in a way, I mean, as easy to use a smartphone that is built like that as it is to use a book. So you don't need much introduction, I mean, to learn how to use a book. There's nice studies about that. I mean, people getting presented a book in the 1950s or 60s, people who've never seen one get presented the book, and then, I mean, it takes like 30 seconds or so and they understand how to use that. I mean, that is just a thing that you learn by doing, and then people immediately get what it is. And with a smartphone, that is the fascinating thing in the user experience. It seems to be very similar. So that is really something. And if you think of the two things that the smartphone provides, first of all, Apple has sold more than 1 billion iPhones. This is 1 billion phones at the price tag of like $1,000. I don't think that there is anything comparable to that ever in value creation. And the second thing is that it created a secondary market, which is the Android market, where you can get smartphones as cheap as $20, which for many people in the world seems still a lot of money, but compared to any other medium, it is not. And of course, it offers a lot of things that you can do with it. And one of the great things that you can do with it, or the worst things that you can do with it, is connecting to other people via social media. So social media has been in the making over the last, I would say, 20 years or so, in terms of technology that facilitates us, and has seen a lot of change if you compare it to the early internet, which was very elite, very much concentrated to an academic elite in the US and to some extent in Europe. With the smartphone and social media running on the smartphone, that from the beginning was not so much the case. It was much more inclusive worldwide, and that is one of the succeeding factors. What it does, however, I mean, it changes media consumption from this kind of feeling of being in the crowd to kind of feeling alone, being in a solipsist situation. So this book by Sherry Turkle, when it came out, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, I found it really depressing and was not at all fond of it, and I was very critical in reading it. Today I see it a bit more differentiated. I mean, seeing how much sometimes I suffered myself of feeling alienated on social media. So I think it is worth considering what in the psychology of media usage, social media changed. I mean, if you read a book, you are on your own as well. I mean, so solipsist media consumption is not totally new to people. However, you don't connect to other people through the book. So that is so to say the dialectic moment in media usage that the smartphone and social media apps running on the smartphone do with us. We consume the media like reading a book. But on the other hand, it is like being on the phone and having a conversation with other people. But it is neither of. It is really something totally new. And so it is really worthwhile looking into the psychology and giving that some weight, what actually happens in using social media. This prison of social media has been around, I mean, also like 25 years or so. I think it was started in something like 2005 by a company, I forgot by whom. I put the link in, and you see all these media, that most of which I've never heard of, kind of classified. So there is no shortage of looking at social media from this kind of commercial or advertising perspective. And if you think of social media, I mean, where does it come from that the social media is such a success? That has also, of course, to do with the business model behind it. And the business model behind social media is that social media is indispensable, or has become indispensable as a medium for doing public addresses. So if you want to reach people, I mean, this study by Kantar Media is from 2020. Kantar is one of the largest, or the largest market and media research institute. It's public. It's part of the WPP group, which is the largest advertising conglomerate. I used to work as a managing director for one of WPP's advertising firms, Mediacom, about 10 years ago. So this, I have to disclaim that I have some affiliation with that, although hopefully I have a critical distance to it now. So what this report says, that it is advertising on social media, even with the distrust that most people now can articulate against the platforms, is still the most cost-effective medium for advertising. Cost-effective means that for each ad that you place, you get in return more of the effect that you want to achieve than it costed you, than from any other medium. So effectiveness, as I put together in the video introduction on media business models, that goes a bit more of that into that detail, means that you have some kind of objective. For example, bringing something to people's awareness. And then if you make a survey and ask people, did you know about that fact? People say yes. And if you ask the same people like a few weeks earlier, they would have said no. And this is the effect. That's the effect of advertising and public relations. And if it is cost effective, that means that there is no other medium providing the same effect at that cost. So this is an interesting first hint why social media seem to be so successful in terms of creating value for their shareholders. So, and the influence is that in particular the attitude of people towards brands seems to be very effectively changed by how brands appear in social media. So what this report says, that how a brand acts on social media is the single largest influence on brand's reputation of all measures that a brand can take. So it is much more important than any other kind of social responsibility or quality issues or whatever, is really how they act on social media. And 80%, so 78% of consumers using consumer-generated media, as this report calls it, so almost 80% of consumers use social media as the primary source of news and the primary source of information on brands that they want to buy. So that shows you the power that social media have. I don't think the television or the newspapers ever had so much influence on people's opinion. And that is very well understood, as we shall see, with a phenomenon that's called the filter bubble, or kind of the collaborative filtering, which means that people I know say things, or it appears in a conversation that I'm actually part of. So this is, I think, one of the key features that we have to understand if we discuss social media and how it works. So it is interesting to look into history, I mean, as on its own right, I would say, but with social media in particular, I mean, if people now discuss the problems that are discussed with Facebook and kind of these lynch mobs that run havoc in countries that form on WhatsApp and so on, it is very interesting to see, I mean, how long that has actually been going on. And I mean, people were writing about it, and not only in academic papers or in left discussion groups, no, in really mainstream publications. So the well is regarded as the first social medium. And now we come to the definition, what we mean by talking about a social medium. So in the early 1980s or mid 1980s, Stuart Brand, who was an activist, an environmental activist, and really an interesting guy. I mean, he is still an interesting guy. Set up a server, a computer, basically a small computer for today's perspective, with modems, so you could dial in. Other people did that as well at that time, so the so-called Bulletin Board Services, BBS, were very common. I used that with my first computer, so you had to dial up. You would connect a one-on-one connection, and then the computers could talk to each other with a program, a protocol that used modulation, demodulation, that would change the computer's output into sounds, basically, that could run over the telephone network. The telephone network at that time was completely analog, so that was the only way of communicating between computers over far distances was with these dial-up lines and these kind of beeping sounds. For text transfer, that was sufficiently fast, so it was actually totally okay, and you could in these bulletin board services, you could not only receive data, like for example, code that people would, like small program scripts or so, you would exchange among users. You could also write on a forum where you would see other people's posts as well. So you could upload your comments and download other people's comments. So this is kind of the nucleus of what happened in the early 1980s, and that became really, for the first time, I think, really usable in a bulletin board service called The Well. So The Well was this computer where people could dial up, and it had, of course, to do with Stuart Brand being such a prominent figure. So Brand, in the 1968, had published the Whole Earth Catalog. The Whole Earth Catalog was kind of this everything that made kind of early environmentalism and hippie culture and thinking of the Earth as spaceship Earth and so on. I mean, so it was really this 1968-ish environmentalism, and had faded out at the late 70s, around 1980s, I think the last catalog came out, because it kind of turned mainstream. I mean, the first organic food stores were successfully established, and not only in the US, in many countries, like in Italy, in Germany, and I can't say about other places in the world because I don't know that, but these two places I can speak with my own knowledge. So this is Stuart Brand. So he was a very famous guy, and then other people joined. They were also famous, like John Perry Barlow, who was the lyrics writer for a band called The Grateful Dead. That was popular in the Bay Area. So we are speaking of the first wave of Silicon Valley at that time, the personal computer wave, when companies like IBM became that. Before that were mostly producing servers, became suddenly drawn into this market of end-user computers, the desktop computers. And so in California there was a lot happening, and so The Well was very successful at in this community in San Francisco. It's kind of a mixture of technology people and environmentalists and hippies, and then a second hub established in Austin, Texas, for the same reason. People like John Lepkowski or Bruce Sterling joined that, who are on The Well to this date. So The Well still exists. And I joined The Well, I think in 1993 or something like that. And a really interesting thing happened. I mean, I was in my early 20s. I was very naive. I just went there, and I was totally shocked how brutal people's language was, how incredibly hateful people were reacting to what other people would say. So I would say something, I would type in my comment very naively. I mean, I was not that stupid, I think. And then people would totally flame me for how stupid I was. I mean, really, like you would experience now. And I never posted anything again then, because I said, oh, oops, I actually don't want to be like that. And that is unfortunate in a way, because if I had met the right people, probably I would have a proper introduction and people would have been much more friendly. But I noticed this dynamics of social media very early on, of this in and out. So you can be inside and then people are friendly to you, and you can be outside and then they are very unfriendly. And we shall discuss that on Wikipedia in our studio session for this week. The article that you have in your readings is in that super interesting. It's a very long read, and it is very interesting to learn about these personalities early on, and think of that as being now. I mean, this is 40 years ago when that happened, and how much of it you see daily on social media that still exists. So if you read this last paragraphs of the article, so if the well can be recreated is doubtful. That is the point at that time in 1996 when the article was published. That seemed maybe the way, because the web had turned into web pages. They were not interactive. Web pages were basically people would put up a page and would have nice images on it, but there was nothing to interact with. So that is the feeling that of the time when the article was written. But other things I think are very well put. So the well was dependent on the condition under which it began. The same could be said for the culture at the origins of the net itself. So if you think of the origins of the net itself, it's the military. On the one hand, it's in particular the academic military. So it's people on university contributing to military research, which should tell you something about why the net is the way it is. As they say then, go back to the beginnings of ARPANET and you find a handful of people with roots in academia who embedded their quirks and idiosyncrasies in that culture. Quirks that will always be there, no matter how many people come later. And I think this is exactly the discussion to have. Every medium like that, the whole internet, but all these social media, be it Twitter, be it Facebook, are created in a way that makes it very hard to change. It is that way, and the rules are embedded in the code. So while at first the code might not appear as political, later when other people join and want to change the rules, it becomes clear how very, very rigid and viscous this code is. I want to switch from the well now to another form of social media that had been around as long as the internet, basically, which is a different protocol than the web, and it's called the Usenet. So the Usenet is basically a collection of text that people post in a forum-like way, and it's its own protocol of organizing information. The Usenet faded out when the World Wide Web was built. I just show you one of these groups, the CompAI neural net groups. That is a group that I always was part of in the beginning because I wrote my thesis and everything at the time when I wrote my thesis that I wanted to know was basically discussed in this group, because all the AI and neural net researchers would be there and would just write about the things that would interest me. So as you see here, that is Google, and what happened is that Google, before the Usenet would totally go down the drain, bought it. So Google acquired, so to say, what was left of the Usenet and put it into what then later would become Google Groups. So if you want to experience it, go to Google Groups and try it out. I mean, of course, in NYU we have Google Groups that are proprietary to NYU, but there is still this whole universe of independent Google Groups. And the interesting thing, I'm thinking of social network, that the dynamics that we see on these use groups is that they show the same patterns of harassment and violence that we see in social media today. So, I mean, this paper is also from the mid-90s, and it also, I mean, it already researches a history of this indecency. Just the question of pornography here, but it goes really deep, and you find every horrible thing in it already laid out. So if we look at the problem of harassment, of violence in social media nowadays, I mean, as we discussed, letting the Atlantic even have a story that Facebook is a doomsday machine even, you see how long a story that has been and how much it has to do with the technology platform. And I don't think it is just people. People are not so bad usually on their own. You need to give people a tool to be worse. The discussion is, I think, very much like the discussion on gun control. The people in favor of guns always say, well, it's not guns that kill people, it's people who pull the trigger. And to some extent that's true. However, if you don't have a gun, you can't pull a trigger. It's much harder to be violent. And you see that in the numbers. I mean, in countries where there is very few guns, like in the UK, there is hardly any gun-related violence, of course. And generally the violence is then much lower. So I think in a way, although that is maybe a bit drastic to compare social media with guns, in a way we have the same factor here. It is a bit techno-determinist, the push that it gives. It's not only the technology, however. It is, of course, also the business models. It is particular the business models in making it possible for advertisers to be effective. And for that, of course, you need to have data. And the data has been scrutinized over the last years quite a bit. And if you think of what data is, I mean, this is one of the stories that is the rare exception. Usually the problem of the data, how Facebook, Google, Twitter and their likes use the data, is not so much that they sell it to governments, although that is, of course, also horrible. I mean, you might think of making kind of innocent comments to friends or so, and then governments can just access that and can build a profile and find all kinds of cases to categorize you as a potential threat, or learn about your social network with other people and maybe extort by putting other people under pressure, as that has happened. You see that in the Snowden, we come to that in the lecture on surveillance and control. I mean, the Edward Snowden files show that the NSA has a whole toolkit how to use the conversations on social media that the NSA is listening to extort from people. So the problem is on the one hand, of course, the data that is being given to governments. You can't buy the data, and no company can buy the data from Facebook. They will not sell you data. That is how the media depicts it. What you can, however, do is you can place advertising that is super precise. So you find out who are the people whom you want to address directly your message towards. And these people you can find, and since ideally, I mean, what you want to say is very specialized, that's very cheap. Because every single user that you reach, that's just fractions of a cent. So, I mean, if you know whom to reach, you can have a super efficient campaign. Yeah, and then of course, I mean, thinking of the data, I mean, who owns that? When the company Radio Shack, a few 10 years or so back, went bankrupt, they sold all their customer data on the market. I mean, the sequester, I mean, the lawyers basically who had this bankrupt company to sell to pay off the debt. What they did is they sold, I mean, the credit card information, the addresses, the phone numbers or so of all the Radio Shack companies on the market. And in a way, that happens all the time with companies. So it is not so much that the companies themselves sell, it is that accidentally this data becomes public. As has happened with Parler, right before it was finally taken down. You might have read that. So Parler was this super successful right-wing hate speech app that where people could post all their horrible things and all their racism and sexism and violence. And Parler finally, people spoke up and said, we don't want apps like that anymore in the US. I mean, the US is very focused on free speech. That means that you can say everything, and it's kind of sacrosanct because it's in the Constitution. So you can say the most horrible things and incite violence and all, and no one can do anything about that. But finally, I mean, companies would react, and Amazon on whose servers on AWS Parler would run, would decide to remove Parler as a customer because it was so damaging to their reputation. And right before that happened, someone found that Parler was actually very poorly secured. I mean, to say the least, they were really stupid actually, how they handled their things, and all the data was leaked. And that is, of course, I mean, on the one hand, everyone says, there's right-wing people, now all their data lies around. But of course, on the other hand, I mean, that is not right. I mean, there is a lot of doxing happening. A lot of people get accidentally exposed. I mean, like people who may just accidentally be on there, or teenagers who might be involved or so. So there is no protection for that if a thing like that happens. And that is one of the, I think, very severe aspects of social media, that it is actually very personal data. Data, as we shall see in the session on big data next week, tells the story of your life, of your attitudes, of your friends and affiliations, in a very precise and very lucid way, really, and that this data is actually centralized, and everyone more or less probably can intrude it at some point. So this is one of the political problems, I would say, in social media, that is totally different from the question of is there harassment, is there political polarization or anything like that. Another thing has to do with the ownership. All these platforms, I mean, including Google, I mean, are corporations and have a huge kind of almost monopolic power on single users. So if you have a company or an organization or just your private blog, and Google doesn't list it anymore, no one will find it. And if someone removes you from social media, it's very hard to reconnect to people. And for this anarchist blog, this is exactly what happened. So basically, without any warning, as these things go, Facebook just removed them from Instagram. And I mean, of course, then what to do next? I mean, that was their major point of addressing their followers. And there's no oversight over that. I mean, in no country, I think. Basically, it's not like that there would be a committee or you can file a complaint, and then people look into that and say, well, that was unjust, and it is totally in the discretion of these platforms, because they are privately owned platforms. They can remove whomever they want. And that is not only the problem of corporations, of for-profit platforms. As we shall see in the studio session on Wikipedia, Wikipedia as a organization, a US-based organization, an association, I mean, Wikipedia is an entity, and of course Wikipedia works the same way. They are not accountable to any kind of public oversight. And at the best you can say that Wikipedia is to some extent at least accountable to things in the US, however, not anywhere else. So, I mean, clearly we see here something that is unresolved, and I think it is really important to define policy over the next years of regulation, and really everywhere in the world, to not only censor and moderate the content on social media, but also to guarantee users' rights on social media, that they can't just be discriminated and cancelled away. And regulation like that exists. For example, in Germany, everyone has the right to open a bank account, even if they have no money. I mean, of course, you wouldn't get a credit line, but you can have a bank account if you can't be denied that. And I think regulations like that, or in New York State, everyone has the right to rent a car, even if they don't have a credit card. So you can make these exclusion of people harder and inclusion easier, and have a kind of a proper process, a due process, if people really get their rights denied. I want also to move towards maybe a bit more esoteric social media that also have huge influence, but you might not really have them on your radar. One of the most influential is Reddit. We've certainly come to Reddit over the course a bit more. Reddit is a bit similar to things like the Well or the Usenet. Basically, everyone can start their discussion, and then some of the discussions, I mean, you can find basically any topic on Reddit. Some of the discussions are really great. However, I can assure you there is nothing so low as you wouldn't find it on Reddit. I mean, there is really all the dirt and every horror that you can imagine also there. So that is the conundrum of social media. There is really a lot of nice things, and a lot of great things are happening on Reddit, but it is always poisoned. It's always kind of spoiled by the toxicity of people. Yeah, this is in a way very sad, because actually I like being with people on social media. And then, of course, it goes even more niche. I mean, there's kind of this movement of conspiracy theorists, so from one obscure medium to the next, and maybe they get shut down as well. And so you have seen the social media prism, so there's no end of it, and it's very easy to set up your own. Thankfully, the government of the UAE prevents you, unless you are on campus, from experiencing the worst of it. So this is my attempt to access 4chan, which is one of these junk holes on the net. I don't at all encourage you to go there, but it is certainly, I mean, if you think Reddit is difficult, and 4chan, I mean, there is just, I mean, and there is even worse than 4chan. Yeah, speaking of my own history, again, I mean, my own subjective path through media, I was very much in favor of social media when it came out. When I joined Twitter at first, I mean, like the first month or so, I mean, I was still kind of scared, because with the Well, I had these unfortunate experiences. But then I saw that many people that I really liked were on Twitter as well, and I started connecting to them. And in 2007 and 2008, that was a total liberation for me. I mean, like totally expanding my social sphere, and by that getting connected to people who I would be very much politically aligned, which is very interesting. I mean, thinking of our political discussions these days. So I would find my way into the Pirate Party, which is a political organization that started in Sweden in 2006. A friend of mine, Peter Sunde, who's an artist, was sentenced to prison for infringing copyright of music copyright owners with his platform, the Pirate Bay. And people around Peter kind of joined together to defend him, and so we can only really defend him if we are political. And So they formed the Pirate Party in Sweden, and then the same year, a few weeks later, in Germany as well. But I didn't really know anything about that because, I mean, how would I? There were no social media, but then I joined Twitter and learned about it, and so I became very involved in that. And the interesting thing now happened. I kind of thought that everyone on Twitter was kind of the same as me. There were some people were more difficult, and the same was, by the way, true in the Pirate Party. I mean, all people I met, they were really great and super intellectual and interesting to hang out with, and everything was great. And then suddenly, my friend Benedikt Köhler, who was in social media monitoring, I mean, he worked professionally there, while I was just a social researcher for all media. So he was very focused on that. I mean, he said, actually, I found out there's really strange things happening on Twitter. And then he showed me. And if you used a certain search term, you would suddenly see that there's all these fascists on Twitter in 2008. And I never had seen any of that. They were totally, I mean, there were no connections. And then we started to research it, and we see that how much the Twitter sphere would kind of be separated into spheres of people who would know each other, and they were completely disjunct from those who didn't. And at about that time, that appeared to many people. And Eli Pariser, who's an activist, kind of US activist, called it the filter bubble. So this is Pariser's, he wrote a book about that even in 2011, the filter bubble. And what he says is that the recommendation algorithms, but also, I mean, just how you look for people, like by looking who follows your friends and follow them as well, that kind of creates a very close shop of people staying together in their community. It's really a bit like in an academic community or in any kind of community that you stay among each other. And maybe once in a while someone from another community shows, but that's not really very effective. And so this is the interesting thing. So it is not, I mean, you can blame that on algorithms, but it is more interesting even if you think of collaborative filtering. Collaborative filtering is looking what people you find interesting also find interesting. It's like when you go on Amazon and say, people who bought this book bought these books too. I mean, often that is a good way of finding content that you like. And looking at your friends and look at the followers of your friends and follow them as well also creates, I mean, widens your network of potential friends. So this is what creates the filter bubble, and it is not yet algorithmic. However, Facebook and Twitter in particular created this acceleration, this algorithmic acceleration of the filter bubble by sorting what you get shown. So the messages that you get exposed on Instagram, on Twitter, or on Facebook are ranked by what Facebook thinks or Twitter thinks makes you stay the longest. That is their success metric. So they experiment permanently in changing their matrices in so-called A/B testing. So like what happens if we change certain parameters of our model that ranks the messages and then measure the stickiness, which is the time that people stay on the app. And always the algorithms win who increase the steadiness. And by that it happens that you get kind of in this echo chamber, as people have been calling it, that you get reinforced your own opinions, in particular your own political opinions, because this is what people like to see. People raging about the same things that make you angry, and so on. So this is a twofold problem. The one problem is the algorithm problem, and I think this can be solved in a regulatory way. You can just say, dear social media owners, this is a really bad idea, you shouldn't do that. However, the second problem is much more pervasive and much harder. I think this is kind of this gremlin that's stuck deep into the system, which is collaborative filtering. As soon as you have kind of these followers of your friends, and think of or you look at with whom your friends have interesting conversations, and then you follow these conversations and follow the same people as your friends do. That alone is strong enough to create this filter bubble. Because at the time when I ran into the filter bubble, or I became aware of it, there was no algorithmic filtering yet. And that is also why apps that don't have algorithmic reinforcement, like WhatsApp or Signal, are prone to exactly the same problem. Because people on WhatsApp, on messaging apps, tend to also just flock with the same people. Like the old saying goes, birds of one feather, they stick together. And that is certainly true on social media. And so I think this problem is much harder to come by, and as long as we have these easy to join networks, we will not get rid of the second problem. Yeah, and I mean, of course, that has been quite some discussion over the last elections in the US and in Europe. I mean, like the German government in the last general election in 2017 introduced a ruling, it's a law, that media companies would be fined by 400,000 euros, I think, per violation if they would interfere in an unlawful way with the election by publishing things that would be regarded as unlawful. This is, it seems a bit blurry, but actually it's not. I mean, there is a very clear criteria what is meant by that. And Facebook reacted by that by immediately hiring thousands, I mean literally thousands of people, journalists and other content moderators looking into the content, and by that prevented actually from the negative interference of, in particular also, foreign intelligence services into the German election in 2017. The same, of course, did not happen in the US, unfortunately, and we have seen the results. I mean, to close the discussion, I want to broaden the view on things a bit. So, first of all, social media, many of the problems that we see in social media accelerated have existed before. So one of the most horrible influences that media had on people's lives that I would know of is the genocide in Rwanda, committed mostly against the people of the Tutsi. So in 1994, more than 500,000, so more than 500,000 Tutsi, and a total of between 600,000 and 800,000 people in Rwanda were brutally killed in a genocidal way, in a very organized genocidal way also. Although the Western media tend to depict that in a different, depicted kind of as spontaneous violence. If later it was more thoroughly studied, and it was very clear that was a misconception, that it was concentration camps, and it was all the arsenal of genocide happened there. So, and what happened in particular was that Rwandan media, state media, but also privately owned media, namely the radio station Radio Télévision Libre de Mille Collines, so the radio of the 3,000 hills, or that's I think how you translate that, would have incredibly violent hate propaganda against the people of the Tutsi, but also against people of the other people, the Hutus, who were against and who were of deviating opinion, like moderate, or they say, well, we can't just kill people, you know. But also against the Belgians as the former colonial power, or the United Nations mission that was then started. So basically they had this kind of ethno-national, ethnocentric hate and polarization going on, and that can directly be linked to what happened then in the genocide. And so that shows you that you don't necessarily need social media. You can have mass media as well, if you control enough of that, to incite people's hate. Vigilance and looking at mass media is generally, I think, a very necessary thing. A second kind of afterthought is like, what does it do? So we read a lot about polarization, so the end of bipartisan politics. So that means that people more and more tend to fall into separate camps. And if you think of the filter bubble argument, that seems very logical. And certainly it has been true in the United States. So in the United States, it seems that over the last 50 or so years, people more and more fall into the one bucket or the other, but there is hardly any middle ground anymore. I mean, certainly if you think of the election Biden against Trump, I mean, certainly no one who would be in favor of Trump could vote for Biden ever, and vice versa. So, and that is exactly this very interesting paper. This is the method that they use. Is they ask people, that is a standardized questionnaire across countries in the OECD. They ask people about their attitudes of other parties, and then look how much these attitudes are different. Like one party stands out in the positive and other parties in the negative, and that is defined as the polarization. And you see that is constantly going up in some countries, like in the US. I mean, if you look more closely, you see that during the Clinton years in the 1990s, that is actually not true. It fell down at first and then started to grow, but certainly in the years Bush and Obama, there is a constant rise of polarization. But there's many countries where that is just not true, where it's totally up and down. I mean, depending when you look, and certainly countries like Norway, Sweden, or Germany, that's not at all the case. I mean, in Germany, it's very consistent. The trend goes to more and more mainstream politics, and that's, by the way, what you see in elections is that the Conservative Party, the Social Democrats, the Green Party, I mean, they get basically the same results. And then there is the smaller parties, and you have, of course, radical small parties like the fascist parties or the radical or more radical left party, but they are less than half the size of the mainstream parties. So this is, I think, really interesting, because if you look at the potential explanation, you see that there is nothing really correlating with it. I mean, if you look at how many people have internet access, that doesn't seem a very good factor to explain it, so it's the same everywhere. Also the mobile broadband, not really an explanation. I mean, you see the US and Germany are very similar. What might be a case, you might think, is the rise of inequality. So the inequality means economic inequality. That's the so-called Gini index, how many people own how much of the wealth of a country. And if you look at Germany, of course, that is, or Canada, that's much lower than in the US. However, if you just look at the trend, it goes up in these countries as well. So it's not that these countries stay more equal. I mean, you have the same rise of inequality basically across the board. So that is also a very poor factor of explanation, and it goes on. I mean, if you think of xenophobia as a driver of polarization, I mean, how many people are not white? Yeah, that seems to be a bit, but I mean, that has been rising in Germany over the last years very much, and doesn't seem yet, at least, to affect the political leanings. I wouldn't make too much promises that stays the case, however. So I think of all the factors, it is probably migration and racial diversity that in the last years creates the problem of polarization. Because as it seems, not that I would be 100% sure of that, as it seems is that there is one part of the population, ethno-nationalist, and the other part of the population is ethno-pluralist. And that seems to get more harder and harder the more inclusion and kind of liberalization took place. It's very interesting in respect, unfortunately, I don't have very good numbers on that, to look on research in India that has been going on, covering the last 20 or so years. So in India, I think a very interesting process happens, so that the political party landscape has dramatically changed with the rise of the BJP, the party of Prime Minister Modi. And what I read, however, as I say, I didn't find good numbers, and I would be very grateful if you would share, if you have some, is that with the rise of BJP, the political consensus in India seemed to have a bit less strength. However, on the other hand, if you look in some of the research that was done in the 1960s that I found, you clearly see that the polarization between, for example, Hindu voters and Muslim voters at that time was also very high. So I wonder how much of that is becoming more visible now with social media and also with the media awareness of it, or if there is really this growing polarization going on. So I don't know that, and I wouldn't make any claims of it. I find it incredibly interesting and worthwhile pursuing more research on that myself. So closing the lecture, I want us just to share a few examples that are I think kind of the more positive examples. One thing that I particularly like is Y Combinator's Hackers News, which is kind of a bucket of nerdy stuff, and I really like reading that. You could blame it for lack of diversity, certainly. But there's no violence in it as far as I experienced so far, and I mean you can use kind of a tool like Flipboard to just see the stuff that's on it, and I really like looking at that. So this is still social media that I use. Also on Twitter I made lists, so I put accounts that I found trustworthy, that I find interesting to follow, even if I don't agree with them politically, into lists. And with these lists, I don't get algorithmic sorting. I get chronological sorting, and I can see what the people actually are talking about. And that is really interesting, in particular, if you want to follow things that are politically difficult. I mean, if you want to follow right-wing politics or so. I mean, if you just randomly look on Twitter, it's too horrible. But if you look for certain discussions and certain conversations and then make your list on that, you can do research on that. I think that is meaningful. Very interesting is also how new platforms rise just over the last days. Clubhouse has been the thing, I would say. It's really like the first days of Twitter. Everyone wants to join. It is, of course, a major hype driven by Andreessen Horowitz, the infamous or famous Silicon Valley venture capitalist company. So the valuation of Clubhouse, like after a few months that they have been up, is already more than $1 billion. What are alternatives? Kind of to close the kind of ranting and all these established platforms. So let's look at alternatives. Signal has been discussed as an alternative in particular to WhatsApp, and to some extent it is. By the way, WhatsApp uses the same encryption that Signal uses. I found it interesting. I mean, there's several news items when just recently WhatsApp changed their end user agreement that seemed to have news value in the Emirates. So what is Signal actually? So Signal came out of a company called Whisper Systems that was acquired, I think, in 2008 by Twitter. So Twitter early on faced, of course, the problem of security, of securing their conversations, the direct messages as well as the tweets. And they did have no real expertise, so they bought Whisper Systems, who was specializing in military-grade encrypted texting. So they were crypto experts. To help them basically, and the team of Whisper Systems said, well, I mean, now we are getting our money from Twitter, and we can't do both. So let's just send our code that we have open source, and that is what they did. They published their protocols. And released the Signal app into a foundation. It's a non-profit that runs Signal. Signal is a centralized system like Twitter or Facebook. That doesn't mean they have just one server or one data center or whatever, but I mean, it's a centralized body who has full control over the protocol. It seems, however, that the protocol is reasonably well encrypted. So the privacy aspect of it seems to be okay. The problem of taking it down, of potential attacks that comes from centralized system is not. I mean, one of the attacks that is once you have access to the server, as you can expect, intelligence services all over the world kind of get at one point or the other, you can just look the times when certain users would send messages, because this is something, even if you can't read the messages, that you find on the server. You see when people are on Signal, and by that create patterns. So if two people happen to be at on Signal exactly the same time, or more or less the same time once, that doesn't tell anything. It's 50 million users or something like that. But if that happens like more and more, it becomes more and more clear that these two people know each other, in particular if you can kind of cross-reference this pattern to other incidences that these people might have in common, like maybe having common friends on other social networks or whatever, if you are looking at these patterns. So this is a potential attack that certainly gets exploited. Yeah, further looking into alternatives. What Facebook, LinkedIn, Google also show is identity management is one of the key features of social networks. So you have your profile, and your profile tells people who you are. And that works also if you sign on. I mean, if you think of the NYU shibboleth, you sign on one thing and then you are signed on every other thing or so. I mean, you know that happens also with Facebook or Google or LinkedIn, that you can sign in on services and then they pre-populate all the fields for you also. And there is services like Diaspora or Mastodon who have that also, who are not corporate run like these, like Facebook, LinkedIn, and etc. So that is one possible alternative. I mean, in particular, Mastodon over the last years has become quite popular as an alternative to Twitter. Yeah, I mean, can't say more. It's just that many people I know use Mastodon. I sometimes do. And then there is a second, more distributed way of thinking of these profiles, which is claim-based identities. So claim-based identities work that you have claims, like, for example, my name is Jörg Blumtritt. So I claim that this is my name. And how would you usually prove a claim? Other people say, well, yes, I know him under that name. And this was the original idea of the Google search algorithm. So the Google search algorithm would not so much try to understand what content on a website would be there. It would look on other websites that would link to Google, that would link to your website, and would say the more people refer to your website and the more people click on these links and end up on that website, the more it is reliable content. So this is this idea of filtering by claim-based identities. There is association, a kind of a joint industry effort is called Sovereign, that uses a blockchain-based approach to fully distribute this claim-based identity, combining it with so-called zero-knowledge proofs. So zero-knowledge proofs allow the claim-based identity so you can prove someone's claim without revealing what the claim was or who you are. So you can kind of circumvent the problem that social networks have, that your claim is kind of your social graph, is your followers. So these are interesting alternatives that certainly, hopefully, will be developed further. This is really what I encourage you to look into. I mean, really do look into these alternatives and try to come up with your own ideas in that and contribute to the discussion in a constructive way. And then, of course, we have financial alternatives, which is basically the non-profit funding, and we shall look into that when we look into Wikipedia, which is our studio session that follows.